The sun punished the earth like a furious god. Helena Vasquez stopped in front of the ramshackle fence, her rough fingers gripping the small bag that contained all she had left in the world. Sweat trickled down her neck, disappearing into the black dress fabric that clung to her body like a second skin. Before her, the ranch house stood solitary against the implacable horizon, a structure of wood and stone that seemed to resist time through pure obstinacy. The wind dragged a cloud of dust that danced around her ankles. Helena closed her eyes, feeling how the grains of sand scratched her skin. Such had been her life, rough, dry, a constant resistance against elements stronger than herself. Roberto's death, 3 weeks ago, had left a strange void that was not pain, but an absence of pressure, as if they had removed a corset too tight that for years had not allowed her to breathe deeply. When she opened her eyes again, she saw him, a tall man watching her from the porch, motionless as a statue of salt. The brim of his hat cast a shadow that hid his gaze, but Helena perceived the tension in his posture, the hand that rested near his belt, the distrust that emanated from him like an aroma. "Good afternoon," she said, with a voice firmer than she expected. "Are you Thomas Brannan?" The man nodded without speaking, a minimal gesture that barely altered his vigilant posture. A dog emerged from somewhere and sat beside him, equally cautious, equally silent. "My name is Helena Vasquez. My husband knew your father." The wind blew again, and this time it seemed to carry away some of Thomas's rigidity. His hand moved away from the belt and rested on the dog's head. Helena observed that gesture with attention. A man who petted an animal with such naturalness could not be completely dangerous. "He's dead," he said, and his voice sounded rough, as if he didn't use it frequently. "My father, I mean." "I know," Helena responded. "Roberto is too. Pneumonia, 3 weeks ago." There was a moment of silence, only interrupted by the creaking of a rusty weather vane turning somewhere nearby. Then Thomas Brannan descended the 3 steps of the porch and advanced toward her. The sun now revealed his face, weathered by the sun with wrinkles at the corners of his eyes and an unkempt beard that partially hid a scar on his left cheek. "Come in," he finally said, pointing toward the house. "The sun here drives even serpents mad." Helena crossed the fence, and as she did so, she had the strange sensation of crossing a frontier much more significant than some simple, weathered, wooden planks. Thomas Brannan's house was like him, austere, functional, without unnecessary ornaments. Helena surveyed with her gaze the bare walls, the worn but clean furniture, the simplicity that spoke of a life reduced to the essential, a solitary man's life. Thomas served her water in a metal glass. His hands, large and calloused, executed, each movement with a precision that denoted years of solitary routine. Helena drank slowly, observing him over the rim of the glass. The silence between them was not uncomfortable but dense, full of unformulated questions. "I'm going to Sacramento," she explained when she finished drinking. "My sister lives there. She's offered me work as a governess in the house where she serves." Thomas nodded, without looking at her directly. Through the window, the evening light drew golden patterns on the wooden table between them. "It's a long road for a woman alone." It wasn't a question, but Helena answered anyway. "Women like me make long roads every day, Mr. Brannan. Only some aren't seen on maps." Something changed in Thomas's expression, a slight wrinkle between his eyebrows, a more prolonged blink. Helena had learned to read these small signs during her marriage, when Roberto's words rarely coincided with what he really thought. Survival for her had consisted of deciphering the true meaning behind facades. "You can stay tonight," he finally said. "Tomorrow the stagecoach continues west." The dog approached Helena cautiously and sniffed her skirt. She slowly extended her hand, letting the animal explore her at its own pace. After a few moments, the dog gently rested its snout in her palm, a gesture of tacit acceptance. "His name is Shadow," Thomas commented, with a hint of surprise in his voice. "He doesn't usually approach strangers." Helena smiled for the first time since her arrival, a small smile that barely curved the corners of her lips, but that momentarily illuminated her dark eyes. "Perhaps he doesn't see me as a stranger." As afternoon gave way to twilight, Helena observed how Thomas moved around the ranch, feeding the cattle, checking fences, performing the 1,000 invisible tasks that kept this small world functioning. There was efficiency in his movements, but also a loneliness so deep it could almost be touched. When night fell, Thomas ceded his room to her and prepared a cot for himself in the stable. Before leaving, he stopped in the doorway, his silhouette outlined against the starry sky. "My father used to say that people are like wells," he murmured, so low that Helena barely heard him. "Some so shallow they dry up with the first drought, others so deep you don't even know where the water ends." He left before she could respond, leaving her alone with the echo of those words. Helena sat on the narrow bed, her hands caressing the rough blanket. On the table by the window there was a small wooden carving, a horse in full gallop with each muscle meticulously detailed. She took it between her fingers, feeling the marks of the knife that had created it, imagining the solitary nights when Thomas had given shape to that small piece of life. She returned it to its place carefully, like one who deposits a secret. That night, she slept with the aroma of wood and leather impregnated in the sheets, and for the first time in years, she didn't dream of cages. The smell of freshly brewed coffee floated in the air when Thomas entered the kitchen, the sun barely peeking on the horizon. Helena was already there, stoking the stove fire, her movements precise and efficient. A pot bubbled softly, releasing an aroma that transported him to an almost forgotten childhood. "Good morning," she said without turning around. "I hope you don't mind that I used your kitchen. I found ground corn in the pantry." Thomas remained in the threshold, disconcerted by the familiarity with which this woman had taken possession of his space. It wasn't an intrusion, but something more subtle and disturbing, a presence that filled gaps he didn't even know existed. "I don't mind." He sat at the table while she served coffee in 2 chipped cups. The black steaming liquid seemed darker between her porcelain-cracked hands. Thomas couldn't help but notice how the morning light revealed details that yesterday's penumbra had hidden. A small scar on Helena's chin, the fine wrinkles around her eyes, the strand of premature grey hair hiding behind her left ear. "Roberto never let me cook," she commented while placing a plate of cornbread in front of him. "He said we had servants for that, and that a lady shouldn't dirty her hands." Thomas tasted the bread. It was warm, with a crispy crust and soft interior. He couldn't remember when was the last time he ate something he hadn't prepared himself, something made especially for him. "What kind of man was he?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Helena sat across from him, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the window, where the sun began to gild the hills. "A good man, people would say. Generous with his friends, respected in business." She paused, her fingers playing with the edge of the cup. "He treated me like a porcelain doll, beautiful, fragile, without thoughts of her own, a valuable possession, to show at parties and keep in a display case the rest of the time." Her voice betrayed no bitterness, only a serene statement of facts. Thomas observed her while she drank her coffee, perceiving layers and layers of history behind those measured words. How old was he? 31 when he died. 28 years older than me, Helena responded with a sad smile. My father considered him a good match. I was 16. The silence that followed was charged with meaning like the air before a storm. Thomas thought about the 15 years Helena had spent in that golden cage, about everything she had learned to silence, about the strength she must have accumulated inside herself to not break. "I need to check the cattle," he finally said, getting up. If you want to accompany me, the stagecoach doesn't pass until noon." Helena nodded, and minutes later they walked together under the incipient sun. She had gathered her hair and changed the black dress for a simpler skirt, and a light blouse that Thomas supposed she had taken from her small bag. In daylight, among the dust and elements, she seemed more real than the mourning figure that had appeared the day before. When they reached the corral, Thomas expected to have to explain how to maintain distance, how to avoid frightening the animals. But Helena approached the fence and extended her hand toward a calf that approached curiously. Her fingers caressed the animal's snout with a familiarity that left him perplexed. "My grandfather had a small farm," she explained, reading his surprise. "I spent my first years there, before my father decided I should be Oh, my lady." The calf gently pushed Helena's hand, seeking more caresses. Thomas observed the scene, a strange warmth spreading in his chest. "He didn't succeed," he said, and for the first time since she had arrived, he smiled openly. Helena returned. The smile, a genuine smile that transformed her face, revealing the girl she had been before the world, locked her into a role she never chose. No, he didn't succeed. The sun reached its zenith, implacable, when the stagecoach appeared on the horizon, a cloud of dust announcing its arrival. Helena waited by the fence, her bag at her feet, her gaze lost in the landscape that stretched before her like a golden sea. Thomas remained a few steps back, his rigid posture hiding the turbulence he felt inside. The hours that had passed since dawn had created between them a language of gestures and glances, of shared spaces without need for words. Helena had helped him with the ranch tasks as if she had been doing it for years, sometimes anticipating his needs, moving in synchrony with him in a silent dance of efficiency. Now the stagecoach was approaching, and with it, the inevitable separation. "Sacramento is a big city," Thomas commented, his voice barely audible over the noise of approaching wheels and hooves. "Full of opportunities." Helena nodded without turning. "And cages with different bars," she responded, the wind playing with. Rebellious strands of her hair, Thomas took a step forward, reducing the distance between them. He wanted to say something, but words crowded in his throat, clumsy and insufficient. He who had lived 42 years in the vastness of those fields, who had faced storms and droughts, who knew the language of sky and earth, now felt incapable of expressing the tumult that one day had awakened in his soul. "You don't have to. Leave," he finally said, the words escaping before he could contain them. Helena turned toward him, her dark eyes studying his face as if searching for something hidden in his sun-weathered features. "What are you offering, Thomas Brannan?" The question floated between them, clear and direct. Thomas felt the weight of each word, the responsibility of his answer. In all his years, he had never shared his life, his space, his solitude with anyone. "A place where you don't have to pretend to be who you're not," he responded, with an honesty that surprised both of them. Nothing more, nothing less. The stagecoach was now almost in front of them, the driver pulling the reins to stop the horses. Helena kept her eyes fixed on Thomas's, as if searching in them for an answer to questions she hadn't even formulated. "I must go to Sacramento," she finally said. "I promised my sister I would see her. I need to know I have options." Thomas nodded, a pang of disappointment piercing him like a thorn. But before he could respond, Helena added, "But perhaps I'll return, if the offer still stands." The stagecoach door opened with a creak, and the driver shouted something about haste and schedule. Thomas took Helena's bag and handed it to her, their fingers briefly touching in the exchange. That simple contact sent a shiver down his spine. "Offer will still stand," he murmured, so low that only she could hear. Helena boarded the stagecoach, and the last image Thomas had of her was her profile outlined against the window, her eyes looking forward, toward an uncertain future, but, for the first time in a long time, hers to decide. As the stagecoach moved away, Thomas remained motionless, with Shadow sitting beside him. The dust raised by the horses settled slowly, returning to the earth from where it had risen. Like everything in this life, he thought. Everything eventually returns to its origin, transformed by the journey. That night, in the quietude of his suddenly emptier house, Thomas took out a piece of wood and began to carve it. His rough hands gradually gave shape to a figure, a bird with extended wings about to take flight. Upon finishing, he placed it next to the horse on the table by the window, where the moonlight projected shadows that seemed to move with their own life. 8 days, each one of them a complete universe of familiar routines that, however, now felt strangely empty. Thomas continued with the ranch tasks, spoke with Shadow as he always had, carved wood in the evenings, but something had fundamentally changed in the rhythm of his existence, as if an internal clock that had always marked a constant tempo had suddenly decided to alter its cadence. On the afternoon of the 8th day, when the sun began its descent toward the horizon, tinting the sky orange and purple, Thomas saw her, a figure in the distance, advancing on foot along the dusty road. He recognized her way of walking long before distinguishing her features. and something in his chest tightened with a mixture of disbelief and hope. Helena was returning, and she wasn't coming alone. Beside her, an old pinto horse pulled a small cart where boxes and bundles covered with canvas were stacked. Thomas went out to meet her, trying to control the rhythm of his steps so as not to betray his impatience. Shadow showed no such restraint and ran toward her, jumping and spinning like a puppy, breaking his usual composure. "I see someone's happy to see me," Helena commented when they were close, a smile illuminating her face. There was something different about her, a luminous quality, as if she had left behind an invisible weight. She wore her hair loose, swayed by the breeze, and had changed the black dress for a simple blue one that highlighted the bronze of her skin. "He's not the only one," Thomas responded, surprising himself with his frankness. Helena stopped the horse and looked at him directly, her expression serious but serene. Before continuing, "I need you to understand something, Thomas Brannan. I haven't come looking for a new owner. I had one for 15 years, and I won't have another." The setting sun outlined her silhouette, endowing her with a coppery aura that seemed to emanate from her own determination. Thomas felt deep respect before that declaration, before the quiet but unbreakable strength she radiated. "I don't want to own anyone," he responded, with equal seriousness. "This land has taught me that nothing really belongs to us, not even ourselves." Something softened in Helena's expression. With a gesture, she pointed to the cart behind her. "Everything I own is here. My sister offered for me to stay with her as a governess. Her safe, orderly life under someone else's roof." She paused, her eyes touring the ranch, the hills extending beyond. "I chose this. I chose uncertainty, hard work, the possibility of failure. But I also chose freedom." Thomas nodded, understanding perfectly. He himself had made a similar choice years ago, when he decided to stay in this remote place, instead of seeking a more comfortable life in the city. "What are your conditions?" he asked, knowing instinctively there would be some. Helena smiled, and this time the smile reached her eyes, transforming her face into something that made Thomas's heart skip a beat. "They'll work with you, not for you. I'll share the ranch tasks, but also the decisions. I'll sleep in the house, not in the stable or some outbuilding. And never, under any circumstances, will you tell me what I can or cannot do, as if I were a child needing guidance." Thomas considered each word, not because he doubted accepting them, but because he wanted to engrave them in his memory as what they were, a solemn pact, a mutual promise. "I accept," he said simply, "and I add a condition of my own, that you always tell me the truth, even when you think I don't want to hear it." Helena extended her hand, a formal gesture that contained, however, a deep intimacy. Thomas shook it, feeling the softness of her palm against the roughness of his own, a contrast that symbolized everything both brought to this strange partnership they had just formed. As they led the cart toward the house, the sun finally disappeared behind the horizon, and the first stars began to shine in the darkened sky. Thomas glanced at Helena sideways, her profile outlined against the twilight, and felt something taking deep root inside him, something that, like the stars above them, had always been there, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Helena's integration into ranch life was neither immediate nor simple. The first days were marked by a choreography of mutual adjustments, of invaded and ceded spaces, of altered habits and reconfigured routines. Like two rivers that converge, their individual lives had to find a new common course, sometimes with turbulence, sometimes with unexpected calm pools. Thomas, accustomed to moving through his house and lands without considering anyone else, now found himself anticipating Helena's presence, unconsciously adjusting his steps so as not to startle her, moderating the volume of his movements in the early morning hours. She, for her part, learned the ranch's rhythm, the sequence of tasks that marked the passage of days, gradually inserting herself into that flow with a mixture of determination and humility. One afternoon, while Thomas repaired a broken fence, Helena appeared at his side with a bucket of fresh water and a clean cloth. The sun had reached its highest point, and sweat soaked Thomas's shirt, sticking it to his back like a second skin. "You should rest," she said, offering him the wot. "The heat can be treacherous." Thomas drank gratefully, observing her over the edge of the bucket. Helena no longer resembled the mourning lady who had arrived weeks ago. Her skin, once pale, was beginning to bronze from outdoor work. Her hands, which at first blistered easily, were gradually hardening. And yet there was an innate elegance about her that no amount of dust or hard work could erase. "I'm not used to someone worrying about me," he confessed, wiping his forehead with the cloth. Helena sat on the ground beside him, her skirt spread over the dust, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the air vibrated from the heat. "My grandfather chose to say that we're all like plants," she commented with a nostalgic smile. "Some need lots of water and constant attention. Others can survive in the most arid desert, but even the most resistant cactus blooms when it receives care." Thomas looked at her sideways, allowing himself to absorb the image she presented. The strands of hair escaping from her braid, the defined profile against the intense blue sky, the hands resting on her lap, increasingly strong but always delicate in their movements. "What kind of plant do you think I am?" he asked, following the metaphor. Helena turned toward him, studying him with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see beyond the surface. "An oak, perhaps. Solitary, deeply rooted, capable of withstanding storms, but also protective, offering shade to whoever approaches." Thomas felt a strange warmth expand in his chest at those words. No one had described him like that before. No one had seen in his solitude anything more than a simple rejection of the world. "And you?" He returned the question, suddenly interested in how she saw herself. "A vine," she responded without hesitation. "For years, they forced me to grow in their determined direction, around imposed structures, but now—" Her gaze toured the ranch's expanse, the hills rising in the distance. "Now I can choose where to take root and toward where to extend my branches." The silence that followed was comfortable, full of shared meanings. Thomas resumed his work on the fence, and Helena remained at his side, passing him tools when he needed them, holding boards in place, collaborating in a rhythm that felt as natural as the passage of seasons. That night, when they returned to the house under a star-studded sky, something had subtly changed between them. It wasn't a dramatic change, but a small inclination in the axis of their relationship, as if they had found a better balance, a more stable position in the orbit they shared. Thomas lit the oil lamp on the kitchen table, and its golden light created a circle of intimacy in the midst of darkness. Helena prepared a simple dinner, and they ate in a silence occasionally interrupted by comments about the next day's work or practical questions about the ranch's functioning. But beneath that apparent everydayness, both felt they had crossed an invisible threshold. That adaptation, slow and sometimes difficult, was giving way to something new. A complicity, a harmony that went beyond mere coexistence, as if their lives, which had developed in completely different worlds, had always been destined to converge at this specific point in time and space. At the end of the first month, Thomas discovered something unexpected about Helena. It happened on a rainy afternoon, the first in weeks, when the sky suddenly darkened and water began to fall in silver curtains that transformed the landscape. Trapped in the house, Thomas had taken out his account book, a worn notebook where he kept record of the ranch's expenses and income with rough but meticulous handwriting. Helena, who was knitting by the fire, looked up and observed his calculations in silence for several minutes. Then, with a naturalness that belied the importance of what she was about to reveal, she commented, "There's an error in your sums. The right column adds up to 287, not 278. Thomas looked at her surprised, mentally reviewing the figures. "Indeed," he had added incorrectly. "How did you see it so quickly?" Helena set aside her knitting and approached the table, her interest now completely captured by the numbers filling the pages. "I've always been good with mathematics," she explained, running a finger down the columns of figures. "My grandfather taught me when I was a child. He said numbers don't lie or judge, they just are." Thomas yielded the pencil and watched amazed. As Helena reviewed page after page, correcting errors, reorganizing columns, transforming his chaotic system into something clear and ordered. Her fingers moved with the confidence of one who masters a language, her eyes shining with an intensity he had only seen before when she worked with the ranch animals. "Roberto never knew I kept his accounts," she commented, without looking up from the paper. "I did it secretly, correcting his accountant's errors before he saw them. If he had found out—" She didn't finish the sentence, but it wasn't necessary. Thomas could imagine the late husband's reaction to such a transgression of established roles. "Could you teach me?" he asked, the question arising spontaneously. "I was never good with numbers." Helena looked up, surprised. For a moment, she seemed not to understand the request, as if the idea that someone would value her knowledge, especially a man, was completely foreign to her experience. "You want me to teach you?" The incredulity in her voice made Thomas feel a pang of sadness. How many times had her ideas, her abilities been dismissed or ignored? How many talents had she had to hide so as not to threaten the fragile masculine ego that surrounded her? "If it's not a bother," he responded softly, "I think it would be good for the ranch, for us." That us floated in the air between them, charged with meanings they didn't yet dare to name. Helena held his gaze for a long moment, as if evaluating the sincerity of his request. Finally, a slow smile transformed her face, illuminating it from within. "We'll start tomorrow," she decided, returning her attention to the account books. "And Thomas," she added with a tone that mixed humor and determination, "I'll be a demanding teacher." The rain continued falling for hours, a watery curtain that isolated them from the outside world. Inside the house, under the golden light of the lamps, Helena and Thomas leaned over the account books, their heads almost touching, their voices a constant murmur that mixed with the sound of water on the roof. Occasionally, soft laughter broke the rhythm of conversation, a small moment of complicity that resonated in the space between them. That night, while the storm subsided and stars began to peek between the scattered clouds, Thomas carved a new animal for his collection, an owl symbol of wisdom. Upon finishing, he left it on Helena's table next to the account book open to a newly organized page. A small recognition, a silent thanks for unearthing abilities he didn't even know she possessed. The change came with the subtlety of seasons, so gradual they barely noticed it until it was completely established. There wasn't a specific moment, a clear line they consciously crossed. Rather, it was an accumulation of small gestures, of shared spaces, of trust, built slowly like nests are built, twig by twig, with patience and purpose. One October morning, while they milked the cows together, their hands accidentally brushed over the animal's back. Instead of pulling away, as would have happened weeks earlier, both maintained contact a second longer than necessary. A brief moment, but charged with recognition, with a silent electricity that ran through their bodies like contained lightning. The days grew shorter, and cold nights forced them to sit closer to the fire, their silhouettes casting elongated shadows on the wooden walls. Helena read aloud while Thomas carved, her soft voice bringing to life stories he had never known. Sometimes when she paused to take a sip of tea, Thomas would look up from his work and observe her. The defined profile against the firelight, the fingers that turned pages with reverence, the lips that formed words as if caressing them. In those moments he felt a longing so deep it frightened him. He who had lived decades in solitude, who had convinced himself he needed no one, now couldn't imagine the house without her presence, the ranch without her laughter, mornings without the sound of her steps. One afternoon, while they repaired a broken window together, Helena cut herself with a piece of glass. It wasn't a serious wound, barely a scratch on her palm, but blood immediately flowed, bright against her skin. "Let me see," Thomas asked, his voice rougher than usual. Helena extended her hand toward him, a gesture of trust that didn't go unnoticed by either of them. With a delicacy that contrasted with his rough appearance, Thomas cleaned the wound with a dampened handkerchief, his calloused fingers holding her hand as if it were the most precious object in the world. "It's nothing," Helena murmured, but didn't withdraw her hand. Thomas nodded, unable to speak. The proximity between them was overwhelming, charged with unexpressed meanings. He could feel Helena's pulse under his fingers, the slightly accelerated rhythm that betrayed that she wasn't as calm as she appeared. With a slow, almost imperceptible movement, Thomas lifted Helena's hand and, in a gesture that surprised both of them, pressed his lips against the wounded palm. A kiss as light as a butterfly's flutter, but that resonated between them like thunder. When he raised his gaze, he found Helena's eyes fixed, on him, dark and deep like wells in which he could willingly drown. There was no rejection in them, only a mixture of surprise and something more, something that made his heart race until it hurt. "Thomas," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "But—" He pulled away, suddenly conscious of what he had done, of the line he had crossed without permission. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, taking a step back. "I shouldn't have—" Helena closed the hand he had just kissed, as if wanting to preserve the sensation of his lips on her skin. For a moment, both remained motionless, trapped in a space between what they had been and what they could be. "Don't be sorry," she finally responded, her voice firm despite the emotion that made her tremble slightly. "I'm not sorry." That night when Helena retired to her room, she found on her pillow a small wooden carving. Two birds perched on the same branch, their bodies inclined toward each other, almost forming a heart in the negative space between them. She caressed the smooth surface, feeling under her fingers the marks of the knife that had created it, imagining Thomas's hands giving shape to this silent message. She placed it carefully next to the other figures he had been giving her, a growing collection that told the story of their relationship better than any words. And for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Helena slept with a smile on her lips, dreaming not of what she had left behind, but of what she might find ahead. November arrived with cold winds that swept the hills and tinted the landscape copper tones. The ranch prospered under Thomas and Helena's joint care. The improvements she had suggested in management were beginning to bear fruit. Accounts were organized, cattle increased, and they had even occasionally hired 2 young men from the nearby town to help with specific tasks. Their relationship also flourished, growing in the shared intimacy of days and nights, in glances and touches that were no longer accidental. Thomas had learned to express with gestures what he still couldn't say with words, and Helena to receive affection without fear, without the constant shadow of possession that had marked her previous marriage. It was on a particularly cold afternoon, when the past knocked on their door. The sound of hooves and wheels alerted them, and both came out to the porch to see an elegant carriage stopping in front of the house. The vehicle, black and lustrous, seemed out of place in the ranch's rustic environment, like a chess piece lost on the wrong board. Helena visibly tensed when a man descended from the carriage, tall of aristocratic bearing, with a suit that evidenced wealth and a cane with silver handle that he used more as a status symbol than real support. "Carlos," she murmured, her voice suddenly devoid of emotion. Thomas felt the immediate change in her, as if an invisible curtain had fallen, hiding the woman who had flourished in recent months and returning to the surface the cautious widow who had arrived at the ranch. "Helena, dear," the man greeted, his voice mellifluous, contrasting with the coldness of his eyes. "How difficult it's been to find you, almost as if you didn't want to be found." Another man descended after him, shorter and nervous-looking, carrying a leather briefcase. Carlos ignored both of them and advanced toward the porch with the confidence of one accustomed to the world stepping aside for his passage. "Don Carlos Vasquez," he introduced himself to Thomas, extending a gloved hand. "Brother of Helena's late husband, and this is Mr. Morales, my lawyer." Thomas briefly shook the offered hand, feeling immediate antipathy toward this man who had brought the shadow of the past with him. Beside him, Helena remained as motionless as a statue, only the slight trembling of her hands betraying the inner turbulence that invaded her. "Thomas Brannan," he responded dryly. "What brings you here, Mr. Vasquez?" Carlos smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes and resembled more a predator's gesture of showing teeth. "Family matters, I'm afraid. My sister-in-law departed so hastily after my brother's death that certain details remained unresolved." Helena stepped forward, recovering part of her composure. Her voice, when she spoke, had an edge Thomas had never heard before. "There was nothing to resolve, Carlos. Roberto left everything in order." The lawyer coughed nervously and opened his briefcase, extracting a bundle of documents he offered to Helena with trembling hands. "Actually, Mrs. Vasquez, your late husband left considerable debts to Don Carlos. $3,000 to be exact, loaned for investments that never bore fruit." Thomas observed how blood left Helena's face, leaving her pale under the tan she had acquired in months of outdoor work. But in her eyes, instead of fear, he saw something different, a spark of controlled fury, of determination. "This is a lie," she declared without taking the documents. "Roberto never borrowed money from Carlos. On the contrary, it was Carlos who always came to him when his gambling left him without funds." Carlos's smile froze, and for an instant, his mask of courtesy cracked, revealing something dark and threatening underneath. "Careful, Helena. Accusations without proof can be dangerous. I have documents signed by Roberto. The county judge will consider them valid, I assure you." Thomas stepped forward, placing himself beside Helena in a silent gesture of support. The tension in the air was so dense it could almost be cut. "I think you should leave," he said with a firm voice. "If you have claims, you can present them through appropriate channels." Carlos looked at both of them, his expression calculating, evaluating the situation. Finally, he made a small mocking bow. "Of course, we only wanted to give Helena the opportunity to resolve this amicably within the family sphere. It would be a shame to have to take such personal matters to court." The implicit threat floated in the air like the aroma of gunpowder before a shot. Helena kept her gaze fixed on her brother-in-law, her posture erect despite the almost imperceptible tremor that ran through her. "Do what you think necessary, Carlos. I'll do the same." When the carriage finally moved away, raising clouds of dust in its wake, Helena collapsed into one of the porch chairs, as if all her strength had suddenly abandoned her. Thomas knelt in front of her, taking her cold hands in his. "What was that?" he asked softly. Helena closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were filled with an iron resolution that transformed her face, endowing it with a wild and dangerous beauty. "That, Thomas, was the past trying to drag me back to the cage," she responded with a firm voice. "But this time I'm prepared to fight." On the horizon, dark clouds accumulated, presaging a storm. Thomas looked at Helena, at the woman who had arrived as a stranger and had become the center of his world, and knew with absolute certainty that, whatever battle lay ahead, they would face it together. Carlos's threat acted as a catalyst, forcing Helena to unearth parts of her past she had kept carefully buried. That night, sitting before the fire while the storm lashed outside, Helena opened the trunk she had brought from Sacramento, extracting a small carved wooden box that had remained closed since her arrival at the ranch. "You need to know everything before deciding if you want to get involved in this," she said, her voice firm but with a slight underlying tremor. "Carlos won't stop easily." Thomas observed how her fingers caressed the box's surface, tracing the floral motifs that decorated it. A beautiful object that, however, seemed to weigh on her hands as if it were made of lead. "I'm already involved," he responded simply. Helena nodded, silently grateful for his response. She opened the box with a small key she wore hanging around her neck, revealing its contents: yellowed letters, a small account book, and something that gleamed in the firelight, a ring with a green stone. Roberto wasn't what he seemed. She began taking the account book. He maintained a facade of respectability, of business success. The reality was very different. With meticulous precision, Helena explained how, over years, she had gradually discovered the true nature of her husband's business, fraudulent investments, never returned loans, properties acquired through deception. Roberto Vasquez, the pillar of society, the generous benefactor, was actually a man who had built his fortune on lies and manipulations. Carlos was his accomplice in everything, she continued, extracting one of the letters. But while Roberto was careful, Carlos was impulsive. He gambled, drank, created scandals that Roberto constantly had to cover up. As Helena spoke, Thomas began to understand the magnitude of what they faced. It wasn't just a money claim, but an attempt by Carlos to keep the Vasquez family secrets hidden, to silence the only person who knew the truth and could expose it. "Why now?" he asked. "It's been months since Roberto's death." Helena looked up. From the documents, her dark eyes reflecting the fire like deep wells. "Because creditors have begun presenting claims against the inheritance. Carlos needs money to maintain the facade, to prevent the entire edifice of lies from crumbling." She paused, her fingers gripping a letter tightly. "And because he never forgave me for rejecting his advances after Roberto fell ill." This last revelation made something cold and hard settle in Thomas's stomach. The idea that Carlos had tried to take advantage of Helena in her moment of vulnerability awakened in him a protective fury he could barely contain. "Do you have proof of all this?" he asked, struggling to keep his voice level. Helena nodded, pointing to the documents scattered between them. Roberto kept detailed records. I suppose it was his way of protecting himself, of ensuring Carlos could never betray him. When he fell ill, he entrusted me with the location of these documents. She took the ring with the green stone, and he gave me this. He said it was a family heirloom, but that Carlos should never have it. Thomas studied the ring in the firelight. It was old, clearly valuable, with a seal engraved in the gold metal surrounding the emerald. "What does it mean?" "It's the ring of the first Vasques who came to America, a symbol of legitimacy, of connection to the Spanish lineage." Helena smiled without humor. Roberto was extremely superstitious regarding this ring. He believed whoever possessed it would have control over the family fortune. The storm intensified outside, wind howling around the house like a wounded animal. Inside, the fire projected dancing shadows on the walls, creating an intimate but tension-charged atmosphere. Thomas made a decision. With deliberate movements, he gathered the documents and returned them to the box, closing it carefully. "We'll go to town tomorrow," he declared. "We'll speak with Judge Peterson. He's a fair man, and I've known his son for years. He won't let Carlos get away with this." Helena studied his face, searching for any sign of doubt, of recrimination. She found none. Only determination and something deeper, something that made her heart race. "This could be dangerous," she warned. "Carlos has connections, money, to bribe." Thomas took her hands in his blue eyes fixed on hers, transmitting unshakable certainty. "And we have the truth. And each other." In that moment, with the storm roaring outside and fire crackling inside, Helena felt how something inside her finally released, like a long-tied knot that finally came undone. Without words, she leaned forward, and for the first time she was the one who initiated contact, pressing her lips against Thomas's in a kiss that tasted of promise, of trust, of a future that, despite the threats looming over them, finally seemed possible. The county courthouse was an austere grey stone building that dominated the town's central square. That December day, its steps were crowded with curious onlookers who had come attracted by rumors of a confrontation between the widow Vasquez and her late husband's brother. Gossip had spread like wildfire in the small town, fueled by malicious insinuations that Carlos had strategically scattered during the previous weeks. Helena and Thomas descended from the cart under the scrutinizing gaze of those present. She wore a simple dark blue suit that Thomas had never seen before, perhaps saved for occasions like this, a memory of her previous life. Despite her apparent calm, Thomas could feel the tension radiating from her, the way her fingers gripped the small leather briefcase containing the documents that could determine her future. Carlos was already inside, surrounded by important-looking men, their voices a constant murmur that ceased abruptly when Helena entered the room. The look her brother-in-law threw her was charged with barely disguised contempt, but also something more, a glimpse of concern that confirmed to Helena she was on the right path. Judge Peterson entered shortly after, an older man with perceptive eyes that had seen too much of the world to be easily deceived. The session began with the required formalities, and soon Carlos's lawyer presented his case, documents supposedly signed by Roberto accrediting a loan of $3,000 never returned, with interest that elevated the debt to a sum Helena could never pay without selling all her possessions. When it was her turn, Helena rose with serene dignity that impressed all present. She hadn't hired a lawyer. She would present her own defense. "Your Honor," she began, her clear, firm voice resonating in the room, "the documents presented by Don Carlos Vasquez are false. My late husband never requested such a loan, and the Ituwa signature appearing on those papers is not his." A murmur ran through the room. Carlos leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something urgently. Judge Peterson observed Helena attentively, evaluating her. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Vasquez," he commented. "Do you have evidence to support your claim?" Helena nodded, and opened the briefcase, carefully extracting several documents she presented to the judge. These are Roberto Vasquez's personal, financial records kept by him personally. As you can see, there's no mention of such a loan, she paused, extracting another document. And this, Your Honor, is a letter written by Don Carlos to my husband 2 years ago, requesting money to cover gambling debts. You can compare the handwriting with that of the documents supposedly signed by Roberto. The judge examined the papers carefully while Carlos shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The lawyer tried to protest, alleging that the documents presented by Helena had no legal validity, but the judge silenced him with a gesture. There's something more, Helena continued, her voice acquiring a graver tone. Don Carlos not only attempts to defraud me with this false debt. For years, he and my late husband were involved in businesses of dubious legality. A collective gasp ran through the room. Carlos stood up abruptly, his face reddened with anger. This is defamation, he exclaimed. My brother was a respected man, and this woman tries to stain his memory to avoid paying what she owes. The judge struck his gavel, demanding order. His eyes moved from Carlos to Helena, evaluating both. Finally, he addressed her. Mrs. Vasquez, these are very serious accusations. If you can't prove them, you could face charges for slander. Helena nodded, perfectly understanding the gravity of her position. With methodical movements, she extracted the last set of documents, the detailed records Roberto had maintained of all his fraudulent transactions, with names, dates, and amounts. These records were maintained by my husband as insurance against betrayals, she explained, her voice firm despite the weight of what she was revealing. They show how he and Don Carlos manipulated properties, deceived investors, and diverted funds for years. The judge took the documents with a grave expression. The room had fallen into sepulchral silence, all eyes fixed on Carlos, whose face had gone from furious red to ashen white. This will require an exhaustive investigation, the judge finally declared. Meanwhile, the debt claim is suspended. Carlos rose abruptly, knocking over his chair in the process. His eyes, fixed on Helena, transmitted visceral hatred that made Thomas tense, preparing to intervene if necessary. You haven't won, Carlos hissed loud enough for everyone to hear. This doesn't end here. Judge Peterson struck his gavel once more. Watch your words, Mr. Vasquez, he warned. What I just heard could constitute a threat, and that wouldn't favor you at all considering the accusations you face. Carlos kept his gaze fixed on Helena one more moment before turning and leaving precipitously from the room, followed by his lawyer and the men who had accompanied him. When they finally left the courthouse, the evening light bathed the square. In golden tones, Helena walked erect, her face serene despite the emotional storm she had just weathered. Thomas walked beside her, conscious of the gazes following them, of the whispers already beginning to circulate. Are you all right? He asked in a low voice only for her. Helena stopped and looked at him directly, her eyes bright not with tears, but with fierce determination. For the first time in my life, I think I am, she responded. I've spoken my truth. I've faced my fear. Whatever comes next, we'll confront it. Thomas nodded, understanding the depth of what she had just achieved. It wasn't just a legal victory, but a declaration of independence, the definitive breaking of invisible chains that still bound her to her past. As they climbed into the cart to return to the ranch, Helena looked back one last time, toward the courthouse, where she had confronted the ghosts that had pursued her for so long. Then, with a sigh that seemed to release years of accumulated tension, she turned forward, toward the road extending before them, toward the future they had decided to build together. Spring arrived at the ranch with an explosion of life that seemed to reflect the interior transformation of its inhabitants. After the trial, Carlos had disappeared. Rumors placed him in Mexico, fleeing from investigations his own documents had unleashed. The shadow of threat he had cast over Helena dissipated like morning mist under the ascending sun. With April's arrival, Thomas and Helena initiated a series of changes at the ranch. What had begun as a temporary refuge, a place of transition, was becoming a permanent home, the nucleus of something greater than themselves. One afternoon, while planting a garden next to the house, Helena stopped, contemplating the horizon with a thoughtful expression. Her hands, now completely weathered by work, held a small tomato plant with the delicacy with which one holds a promise. "I was thinking," she began, her voice mixing with the birdsong announcing spring. "Perhaps we could offer work to women in situations similar to what I was in. Widows, abandoned wives, women who need a place to rebuild themselves." Thomas looked up from the furrow he was digging, observing Helena with a mixture of surprise and admiration. The setting sun illuminated her profile, endowing her with a golden halo that highlighted the determination in her face. "It would be difficult at first," he responded, considering the idea. "We'd need to build more rooms, expand the stable. But it could work," she completed, her eyes bright with the vision of what the ranch could become. Not just a place of work, but of learning. We could teach them what we've learned, that independence isn't just a matter of money, but of knowing you can stand on your own. Thomas approached her, cleaning his hands on his pants before taking hers. The intimacy between them had grown in the months since the trial, transforming into something as natural as breathing. They hadn't formalized their relationship in any conventional way. They didn't need to. What they shared existed beyond names and labels. "If that's what you want, we'll do it," he said simply. Helena looked into his eyes, finding in them the same determination she felt inside. This man who had lived so long alone he had forgotten how to share, was now willing to open not only his heart, but also his home to others. "I want it," she confirmed, her voice firm. "And I want the ranch to have a new name. A name that reflects what it represents for me, for us, for those who come after." "What name?" Helena smiled, a full smile that illuminated her entire face. "Rancho Libertad." The words floated between them, charged with meaning, with history, with future. Thomas nodded, understanding perfectly. It wasn't just a name change, but a declaration of intentions, a commitment to the values both had come to share. That night, sitting on the porch under a star-studded sky, they talked for hours, planning, dreaming, building with words the foundations of what they were about to create. The passion in Helena's voice, the clarity of her vision, moved Thomas deeply. This woman, who had arrived at his door as a stranger seeking temporary refuge, had become the catalyst for a transformation he never would have imagined. As the night advanced, their conversation became more personal, more intimate. Thomas, who had never been a man of many words, found in the darkness the courage to express feelings he had kept stored. "Before you came, I existed but didn't live," he confessed, his voice barely a murmur over the cricket song. "I was like, or one of those trees that remain standing after lightning has split them, hollow inside." Helena moved closer to him, her presence warm against the cool night breeze. "And I was alive but didn't exist," she responded. "I was a reflection of others' expectations, never really myself." Their hands found each other in the darkness, intertwining with the familiarity of those who have found a home in the other. They needed no more words. The silence between them was full of meaning, of unspoken but deeply felt promises. When Helena finally spoke again, her voice had a different tone, softer, almost vulnerable. "I think I'm pregnant." The words fell between them like stones in a pond, creating waves that expanded until reaching the most remote shores of their consciousness. Thomas remained motionless, his mind slowly processing the meaning of what he had just heard. "Are you sure?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Helena nodded in the darkness. "Almost certain. I'm 2 months late and there are other symptoms." Thomas felt something expand in his chest, a sensation so intense it almost hurt. In all his years of solitude, he had never considered the possibility of being a father. The idea of creating life, of having someone who carried his blood, his name, had been an unconsidered path, a door he believed closed forever. With a slow, almost reverent movement, he placed his hand on Helena's belly. There were no visible changes yet, no physical evidence of the miracle that might be gestating inside her, and yet, beneath his palm, Thomas felt something new and indescribable, the possibility of a future extending far beyond their own lives, the continuation of something they were barely beginning to build. "Aye, son," he murmured, the words full of wonder. "Or a daughter," Helena added, covering his hand with her own. "A new life for Rancho Libertad." In that moment, under the starry sky, with the promise of new life growing between them, Thomas and Helena sealed without words a pact that the world they would create for this child, for those who would come after, for the women who would seek refuge at their ranch, would be one where freedom wasn't a privilege but a right, where respect didn't have to be earned but was freely granted, where love didn't mean possession but joint growth. A new world, being born from the dust and sun of the desert, as fragile, and yet as strong as the small life beginning to form in Helena's womb. The following months passed in a whirlwind of activity. With the pregnancy news confirmed, Thomas and Helena dedicated themselves with renewed energy to transforming the ranch. The first expansions began before Helena's belly showed visible signs of the life growing inside her. Thomas, who had always been skilled with his hands, directed construction of a new wing for the house, with additional rooms for the women who would eventually arrive. Helena, with her sharp business mind, established contacts with a lawyer in Sacramento who could help them with legal matters, and with a doctor willing to visit the ranch periodically. The first to arrive was Maria, a young Mexican woman who had fled from a violent husband. She appeared one July morning, with little more than the clothes she wore and a fading bruise on her cheek. Helena, whose belly was already beginning to round under adapted dresses, received her without questions, offering her a place not just to hide, but to rebuild herself. Then came Elizabeth, an English widow whose husband, a gold prospector, had died leaving her with debts and no resources in a foreign country. Tall and thin, with hands that revealed refined education, she adapted surprisingly well to ranch life, discovering in herself a resistance she didn't know she possessed. As summer gave way to autumn, Helena's belly grew along with Rancho Libertad. The first garden harvests were abundant, cattle prospered, and the house, once silent and austere, now resonated with feminine voices, with occasional laughter, with the promise of a nascent community. One September afternoon, while Helena rested, on the porch watching Thomas and the women work on constructing a new stable, she felt a strong kick inside her belly. She placed a hand on the spot where her son or daughter had manifested with such vigor, a smile spreading across her face. Elizabeth, who was passing nearby with a water bucket, noticed her expression and approached. "Is the baby active today?" she asked, setting the bucket on the ground and sitting beside Helena. "Like a wild colt," she confirmed, taking Elizabeth's hand and placing it on her belly so she could feel the movements. "I think he's in a hurry to join us." Elizabeth smiled upon feeling a kick against her palm. In the months she'd been at the ranch, she had become a constant presence beside Helena, learning from her not only the practical tasks of administration, but also a new way of seeing herself, not as a victim of circumstances, but as the architect of her own destiny. "Have you thought of names?" she asked respectfully, withdrawing her hand. Helena looked toward the horizon, where the sun began its descent, painting the sky copper and gold. "If it's a girl, Grace," she responded softly, "for the grace of having found freedom, of having found Thomas, of creating something that's greater than ourselves." "It's a beautiful name," Elizabeth approved. "And if it's a boy?" Helena smiled, a small smile charged with meaning. "Thomas is convinced it will be a girl. He says he can feel it." Both directed their gaze toward the man working tirelessly under the evening sun. Thomas, as if sensing their gazes, looked up and greeted them with a gesture. He had changed in recent months. The loneliness that once seemed an inseparable part of him had transformed into quiet serenity. The women's presence at the ranch, far from disturbing him, seemed to have given him new purpose, a reason to open doors he had kept closed for so long. "He's a good man," Elizabeth commented, approvingly observing how Thomas helped Maria lift a heavy beam, showing her the technique without assuming she couldn't do it herself. "He is," Helena confirmed, her voice soft but firm. "A man who doesn't need to diminish others to feel great." That night, while stars emerged in the night sky, Thomas and Helena lay together in the bed they now openly share. Fatigue, Helena's advanced pregnancy, made finding a comfortable position a challenge, but Thomas, with infinite patience, helped her get comfortable, strategically placing pillows to relieve pressure on her back. Elizabeth asked about names today. Helena commented, her fingers intertwined with his over her rounded belly. I told her you're convinced it will be a girl. Thomas smiled in the penumbra, his large, calloused hand gently caressing the curve that housed his child. I know it here, he said, bringing his other hand to his heart. A girl as strong and free as her mother. Helena turned her head slightly to look at him, studying the profile she had come to know so well. The straight nose, firm jaw, small wrinkles at the eye corners that accentuated when he smiled. Would you have liked a son? She asked, a question she had never formulated before. Thomas took a moment before responding, considering the question with the honesty that characterized all his interactions. Before meeting you, I probably would have said yes, he admitted. A son to teach what I know, to continue with the ranch when I'm gone. He paused, his fingers tracing soft circles over Helena's belly, as if silently communicating with the life growing inside. But now I want a daughter who grows up knowing her worth, who never doubts her capacity to do whatever she sets out to do, who doesn't need a man to tell her what she can or cannot be. His eyes found Helena's in the darkness. Her daughter who's free from first breath, like her mother had to learn to be. The emotion those words awakened in Helena was so intense, she felt tears forming in her eyes. They weren't tears of sadness, but of gratitude so deep it couldn't be contained. I love you, she said simply, the words leaving her lips for the first time, although the feeling had been there, growing between them for months. Thomas leaned toward her, pressing a soft kiss to her lips. When he separated, his eyes shone with emotion that reflected her own. And I love you, he responded, the simple words charged with a truth both had built day by day, decision by decision, moment by moment. In the silence that followed, with night enveloping them like a protective cloak, Helena thought about the path that had brought her to this moment. The pain, loss, fear, but also courage, determination, the will to create something new from the ashes of what she had left behind. Rancho. Libertad wasn't just a name or a place. It was a concept, a promise, a legacy they were building not only for their daughter, but for all the women who would come after, seeking not charity but opportunity, not pity but respect, not temporary refuge but a permanent home for their reborn spirits. Grace's first cry filled the room at dawn on a November day, a small but powerful sound that seemed to alter the very structure of the universe. Outside, the sky was tinted pink and gold, as if the entire world was celebrating her arrival. Helena lay exhausted but radiant, her dark hair stuck to her forehead with sweat, her bright eyes fixed on the small creature that Elizabeth, who had assisted the birth along with the town midwife, now placed in her arms. Grace was tiny, with a mop of black hair like her mother's and blue eyes like her father's. Her fists were closed as if she were already ready to fight the world, her initial cry giving way to soft whimpers as she adapted to contact with air, with light, with life outside the refuge that had been her home for 9 months. Thomas entered the room with cautious steps, as if fearing that too brusque a movement might alter the fragile miracle that had just occurred. He stopped beside the bed, his eyes fixed on the 2 figures who had transformed his existence in ways he never would have imagined. She's perfect, he whispered, his voice broken with emotion. Helena smiled at him, a tired but full smile, and with a gesture indicated he should come closer. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, extending a trembling hand to touch his daughter's cheek with infinite delicacy. Grace, Helena murmured, pronouncing the name like a blessing. Our Grace. The ranch women took turns entering to meet the newborn. Maria brought a small blanket she had secretly knitted for weeks. Elizabeth left beside the bed a carved box containing a lock of her own hair from when she was a baby, a good luck charm according to her family's tradition. Others, arrived more recently, offered small gestures. A flower picked from the garden, a whispered prayer, a silent promise of protection for this girl born in freedom. When everyone withdrew, leaving the new family in the intimacy of their first day together, Thomas took from his pocket a small object, a wooden carving he had been creating for weeks. It was an eagle with extended wings, each feather detailed with meticulous care, eyes fixed on an invisible horizon. So she always remembers she was born to fly, he said, placing it on the bedside table where Helena rested with Grace in her arms. It's beautiful, she responded, her eyes moistening at the gift's symbolism. The sun ascended in the sky, bathing the room with golden light that seemed to bless this new beginning. Outside, the ranch continued with its usual rhythm. Animals needing attention, crops requiring care, women continuing their daily work, building day by day new lives on the foundations of those they had left behind. Helena contemplated her daughter, marveling at every detail of her perfect face, the curve of her eyelashes, the small nose, lips that seemed to form a smile while she slept. In this tiny being converged all the struggles, all the decisions, all the acts of courage that had marked her path. "You'll never be anyone's property," she whispered, repeating the promise she had made so many times during her pregnancy. "You'll never have to choose between being loved and being free." Thomas, seated beside her, took her free hand in his. His eyes, fixed on Helena's, transmitted everything words couldn't express. Gratitude for having taught him to open his heart. Promise to always be by her side, not as owner but as companion. Certainty that what they had built together would endure far beyond their own lives. In that moment of perfect stillness, with Grace sleeping between them and the sun ascending in, the sky Rancho Libertad wasn't just a physical place with its buildings, lands, and animals. It was a concept, a state of soul, a living testament to the possibility of rebirth, of transforming pain into purpose, of converting wounds into windows toward a brighter future. Helena looked through the window, toward the hills gilded by autumn, sun toward the horizon, extending infinitely beyond their property's limits. Somewhere on that horizon, other women waited, trapped in circumstances they believed immutable, invisible or invisible cages. And here, at this ranch that had once been temporary refuge and was now permanent home, there would always be a place for them, a reminder that even in the most arid soils, with sufficient determination and care, freedom can take root and flourish. Grace stirred in her arms, her small fingers gripping Thomas's finger with surprising strength for someone so tiny. A simple gesture that, however, contained all tomorrow's promise. Connection, continuity, the uninterrupted chain of lives extending toward a future none of them would see, but helped mold with each decision. Each act of love, each moment of courage. And so under November's sun, with Grace's first day illuminating a new chapter in Rancho Libertad's history, Helena understood that true freedom didn't consist of being alone, as she had believed at first, but in choosing the chains that bind us to others, not those imposed by fear or obligation, but those forged by love, respect, and the shared promise to grow together toward the light.